Ryan, don't go too far. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the tonight's Write the Docs San Francisco meetup. I'm Monique Semp, and my co-organizer, Maggie Farrow, is here. And first, I'd like to thank our host company, Ripple, and turn the mic over to our host representative, Ryan Young. But first, I wanted to ask, who here is already familiar with Ripple, our host company? You have hands, okay. And is anyone here largely because they had an interest in Ripple? Okay, good. I'd like to know that so we know where it's a good location to host future meetups. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Ryan, and he'll tell us a little bit more about Ripple.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for coming today, and thanks to Monique and Maggie to help out with this, and everyone else that's helped out with the event. Really appreciate it. So Ripple, as some of you know, we use technology that underpins blockchain, cryptocurrency, and trying to use that to basically create an internet of value to send payments as seamlessly as you can send information today, sort of the elevator pitch. And then we've got a lot of different things going on. We have some products for banking and payment partners, for remittances, as well as working on some things to like a protocol to connect different sorts of blockchains and ledgers. So it's a pretty exciting company, and I'm happy to talk to you at length about what we do. We are looking for one more technical writer, so if you are interested, please contact me. I'm happy to talk after the presentation, but I think that's about it. So,
thank you again, Ryan. All right, before we get started here, let's do a show of hands. How many of you here are mostly focused on technical writing, working primarily as technical writers? All right, we've got about half, maybe a little more than half. What about development or engineering? Okay, a couple more. Product? Couple? Support team? Anything else I missed? All right. If we have any recruiters or other people with job opportunities to announce, there will be an opportunity to do that after our primary presentation for the night. And so if you are interested in that, either as a recruiter or as a recruitee, please stick around at the end here. If anyone is interested in volunteering with Write the Docs, in hosting one of these at your office, or in speaking at a future Write the Docs meetup, then you can reach out to Monique or to me on Slack. You can also message on the meetup page, and that will go to the meetup organizers, so we can get you matched up with someone who can help you from there. And I will turn it over to Monique.
Yeah. So on to tonight's presentation from Jay and Sanket. They have started a new company. It's headquartered in Bangalore, but they're spending several months here in the Bay Area, drumming up interest, basically. And they've agreed to show us a lot about their new product, and I'm really interested to hear about it. They've had a good time in the Bay Area, but I think they're homesick and ready to go home. So we'll keep them hopefully busy after this. They've said for their presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand during it. No need to wait till the end. They'll be giving a presentation and then an online demo. So that said, here we go.
Thanks. Hey guys, I'm Jay. I'm one of the founders of DeepSource. So I'll keep it very informal. And the whole point of doing this meetup or a talk is I'll give you a bit of a story. So how it started, like I started programming by contributing to open source. I started with contributing to Firefox somewhere around 7 years back. And after that, like at that time, I was like facing a lot of challenges. I saw a lot of people facing challenges in terms of getting started into open source. And there was a recent study by JetBrains where they just did a study across developers, and they asked, what is preventing you from getting into open source, contributing to open source? And more than 65-70% of the people said that the problem is I don't know where to start, right? I don't know how to get into it. And more things like I get into the code, I don't know, like there's way too many files, way too many folders. I don't know what to look at, where to look at, right? And this was a huge problem. And after, say, contributing, so I contributed to these open source projects like Chromium and Firefox primarily for 3-4 years. Then I joined this company as a first engineer called DoSelect. It was in Bangalore, India. And it was just a team of 2 people to start with. And we started writing our code, right? And we did not do any documentation. It was just code, like there were no tests, nothing. And the problem was we scaled the engineering team from like 1 to 20. And as and when we were scaling, adding new and new engineers, it was really hard for them to understand what exactly were we building and what we were doing, right? And this was a major problem. And I was like, okay, fine. So let's try to apply these rules and conventions followed by open source guys into our code. So these guys can participate, right? As in better onboarding. So that is when I started looking deep into documentation and started following these conventions. So that is where is going to be the first phase of the talk. I'll just keep it very informal. So if you guys have any questions, so it's a simple talk. If you guys have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to answer. So what do you mean, like the documentation? Like I think key 4 things, like you can say as one, inline source code, right? So there are a lot of contradictory opinion that source code itself should be readable. There's no point in writing documentation around it. That's all crap, right? That doesn't make sense. You actually have, because so I was evangelizing the same like 4 years back, right? Source code should be readable by itself. But if you have like few files, few code, it works. When there is like way too much code, it's very hard to do that, right? So, and method and class comments, like apart from inline documentation in your code, method and class comment mean it depends on your project. For example, if you have an API, right? And if somebody is consuming your project, some developer, right? You need to actually, this documentation is completely different from somebody contributing to your code directly, right? And that is and third is README, because that is something which everybody looks at, right? Even though a lot of good open source projects have followed structure in README of how to contribute, where to ping, whom to ping, SIGs, and all this stuff. Not everybody has done it. And the last one is design docs, which if you're really making a huge change into your code, you need to understand not just small components of it, but overall, like how system performance altogether, right? So 2 scenarios. One is if your code have no documentation at all, or if your code have some documentation which is outdated. So most people who struggle with documentation have either of these 2 scenarios, nothing else. And the third one is like not willing to document at all, ignore that. So in terms of outdated documentation, like people who are not really focused much on documentation, they think that that's not really a problem. But in open source, that's a huge problem, right? Whenever, like, for example, Chromium, I had somewhere around 25, 30 commits a day with huge changes into the project, right? And that's open source. And it was very hard for people to, not just in terms of inline code, that gets removed as and when you make the change list or pull requests, but in terms of the overall documentation outside the code was just not getting updated. And if you don't follow that, and since that's not part of your PR or merge workflow, it's just outside, right? You don't care about it. And if you have a wrong documentation or outdated documentation, that's very, very hard for someone setting up your project or trying to understand what the project is. And So this is one of the quote I got from, I think, Kevin. Yeah, he gave a talk on documentation. So the thing, this same thing. So as DeepSource, when we go and sell to companies, right, we say the same thing. Like, if you doesn't mean how good your tests are, right? If you have really good tests, the test depends on completely who is writing the test, right? If the developer is writing some test just for some coverage, the test is going to be worthless. That's the same way. So this is one thing which you have to accept. Like, if you don't know if you're not really a good software engineer, understanding what you're doing, whatever docs you write is not going to help, right? So that is that. And I'll talk about the first scenario where outdated documentation. If you have worked with open source, you would understand this. And this is one of the things. Like, you have to. So this is not going to be a talk where I'll say where this is good and that is bad. It's more about that you can figure out on your own. It's pretty simple. It's more about processes, setting process, so you can make sure your code is documented. Dead documentation. So this is one of the major things. Whenever you make a change request, so say, take an example of some project that's hosted on GitHub, right? Not every documentation is inline, right? Something is outside, something is like in some other. It's hosted in a completely different repository, whatever, right? In that case, whenever you make a change, you please make sure that you delete links until wherever it is leading to. So this is one of the huge things which, if you are maintaining an open source or contributing to open source, you need to take care of that primarily, right? And this is some rules which I got from the Chromium project documentation, where it's more about trimming, right? So there's this quote. Yeah. So there's this thing which Google follows internally, right? So it's not just about writing documentation, it's about your code is as and when it's evolving, you need to trim down the documentation, right? And deleting documentation is one of the major things. If you just follow that, and all, like, your project might not be, face a lot of documentation debt. In case of no documentation, it's always better to start with a README, because it's a simple thing, but what has to be done in README is more like what exactly the project is about. Like, you might think this is silly, because if there are, like, as I said, 2-3 developers into a project, it's not really a problem. Like, when you get 5, 6, 10, then it actually leads to a problem, because these days with all these microservices and all these things, where people actually have, like, so I was talking to one engineer from Docker, they have, or just for Docker, they have some 150 repositories internally, just for the Docker, right? So everybody's splitting things into way too many small parts, and each of these have to be documented in itself, right? So installation steps, in terms of installation steps, it's not just for on your machine or your configuration, it is for all different types of operating systems, and that not just includes your operating system, but if you're, say, using some sort of Alpine or anything, right? Which you need to actually list down what are the things you are depending on. You can actually take that for granted. For example, if you run something on your machine, you don't know if that same thing will work in Alpine. Alpine is a trimmed version of Linux, right? So you need to actually document what are the small packages which you take for granted is actually your project is actually dependent on, right? And configuration instructions, like how do you configure your project? If somebody's using it, how do they configure your project? And contribution guidelines, that is something like in open source, it's more like where to get help, like whom should I ask, right? So all these things. And one other thing which is, like, I think it's very, very important, which we didn't realize long back, was FAQs. Because whenever, even though if you have really good documentation, like we followed all these steps, had a pretty good README and everything, but when somebody installs, it simply doesn't work, right? And they go to Stack Overflow, do something, fix, and then, okay, it works, and they move on. But to document these things along with, say, I tried it on this system, and this did not work. So I did all the search, and this is the result, right? FAQs is something which, in our internal repository READMEs, FAQs take up most of the space than all these other stuff on the top. And that a lot of people don't take it seriously, but I think that's very important, and it has helped us a lot. In case, and there's one more thing called as a Boy Scout rule. So it's more like whenever you go leave a playground, make sure it's better than what you saw it was, right? So it's more in terms of how to progress with, if you have no documentation. One is after you set up the README, it's about you simply cannot say your business or your managers won't simply allow you to sit and fix the documentation for a month. Like you cannot say I'm going on a documentation sprint. That's not possible. So rather, whenever a new PR or a change is merged, incrementally document it. So this has worked because these are things, for example, when I was reading into documentation, like as part of our previous company, we actually did that. We thought, okay, we'll go on a 2-week sprint and make sure it's perfectly documented. That simply did not work out. Like after a week, something broke somewhere here and there, and we diverged our focus on this. So I would say stick to this principle of whenever you touch a new code, it has to be documented. And that kind of really, really helped us. And yeah, the updating documentation with code change is something which is very critical. And at DeepSource, so our primary reason for starting DeepSource is helping developers ship good code. And code means everything surrounded by code, right? So we are building tools which helps you track all these things. So even for documentation, we are building something called as a documentation coverage, and how you can track this documentation as part of your CR or PL workflow. So yeah, apart from this, say you have a README, you have small progressing process set up for adding inline documentation of your code. One more thing is that depending on your project, for example, if it is an API library, right? You can probably start with, in small code bases, it's all pretty simple, but in large code bases, you can probably start with documenting the methods that are like used by the developers, mostly used by the developers, right? You can probably use some flags in Git to see that, like, which part of the code is being changed the most, and you can probably add documentation to that. So yeah, primarily that is what it's about. I think Sanket can talk about how can we track this documentation coverage as part of this process? And yep.
So yeah. Right. So as Jay started off by explaining how we evolved, as in we had, as part of our previous startup, we have seen a lot of things. We have seen a lot of pitfalls in terms of documenting. And then we kind of evolved by learning these lessons. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit into how the processes. So we were talking about setting down these processes and not exactly telling what is good and what is bad. So what I'm going to talk about is how we can actually put down those processes objectively. So it's easy for you to track, it's easy for the team to track, and it's easy for the team to share accountability for those processes. So you actually improve upon your documentation. So let's start with what documentation coverage is. So in simple terms, and we are mostly talking in terms of in-code documentation here. So just to take one step back, how many people here write in-code documentation as part of their job? Right, that's like, okay, so let's say 50% of the audience here. So yeah, so that's mostly what we are going to be talking about here. So not exactly the outside documentation, but in-code documentation. So what does documentation coverage means, right? So it means simply how much documentation is expected and how much documentation is here. As simple as that. And if you think about it, this is something that is, as a common sense, this is something that you'd want to track. Because as a huge part of what a software engineer does as part of their day jobs is to read code. And in-code documentation makes reading that code easier. So it's as simple as that. Measure how much code is expected to be documented versus how much documentation already exists. And that's what documentation coverage is. And it's one of the most important metrics in terms of code quality. The larger set of metrics in code quality is because it directly impacts the readability and extensibility of your code. Because as I said, most of the work that you do is read the existing code so that you can build on top of that code. It directly impacts the readability and the extensibility. So, and yeah, as I was saying, it's generally for in-code documentation, because that is where you spend the most of the time, right? As internally as a team, right? You spend the most of the time inside the code. For external users of your code, or say if you have an API library, that is where your external documentation, matters most. But internally, your in-code documentation matters. And why track documentation coverage? What gets tracked gets improved. Everyone knows this. And if you're not tracking, so one very common analogy that or parallel that I draw is the case of test coverage. We have CI pipelines, but if you're not tracking your test coverage, nobody is writing tests. And people who write tests, people who are taking accountability of CI pipelines, they know that. If you're not tracking your test coverage, you're not writing tests at all. So if you're not tracking your documentation coverage, you don't know who is writing documentation. So and why to track that? So you can actually keep track if every new thing that you're adding in your code actually gets documented. So if you're adding a new class, if you're adding a new method, somebody needs to know how that works, why that method exists. So the major reason of doing that, one of the major reasons of tracking documentation coverage is so that you can enforce this. That, okay, even if you don't have any documentation in your project today, but you want to start writing documentation, the first step that you want to do is at least start adding documentation for anything new that you're doing. And systematically tracking documentation coverage is something that you can use to enforce that. And of course, so tracking also helps you figure out how you can document the undocumented mess that you already have in your project. And slowly, you can build up, you can figure out which are the most touched part of my code, which are the code pieces which people are using the most. And then you can start from there. And if you're not tracking that, you won't ever know this. So, and how do you do that? So the first step into, figuring out documentation coverage, the first step into figuring out how to start writing documentation, in-code documentation, is to sit down with the team and figure out what is the convention that you need to follow. And apart from the README, apart from reading a good README, you need to set down some conventions in the terms of how you are writing documentation and where you're writing the documentation. So how many people are aware of, have written code in Python here? Python? Yeah. So just to give a parallel from there, so in Python you have packages, you have modules, and then you have classes and methods, right? So the first thing to start, even before starting to measure documentation coverage, is you need to define, are you writing module level documentation? Are you writing class level documentation? In the class level documentation, there is something called a done-done method, which is the constructor. Are you writing a documentation on the done-done method or the class? And this is important because that's the convention that you need to set for the entire team. If someone writes, doc strings for your constructors, and someone else is not writing doc strings for constructors, but they're writing for the classes, that's not going to work. So the first thing that you need to do is determine a convention. And then you can start figuring out how you can actually systematically track this. So you can hook up your project with a CQ tool. So as part of every change that you make in the code base, you also get to see, okay, what is the documentation coverage right now? Does the documentation coverage decrease when you make this change? Right? And so you can use a tool, you can build it yourself, or you can use, CQ means continuous quality. I should have explained it here, but eventually I'll in the next slide I'll do that. So CQ means continuous quality. It's just a systematic way of tracking your quality, the same way that you do CI, continuous integration. The same thing is for quality, it's called CQ. So hook it up with your CQ tools. So as part of every change that you make to your code base, you can actually see how many pieces of code should have been documented, and in this new change request, are those being fulfilled or not? And then in the end, if you're tracking your documentation coverage as part of your workflows, if you're visualizing it as part of in a dashboard, which is accessible to every member of your team, you can actually set goals very easily. You can just say that, hey, okay, over the next 3 months or over the next couple of sprints, let's just increase the documentation coverage to, say, 50% to 60%, something like that. And you can actually track that objectively, because whenever you add new doc strings, or whenever you add new documentation, this will grow up, right? So I'll go back to, So, okay, I think it will be a good time to kind of expand a little bit more on that. So by continuous quality, it means everything that you do to ensure the quality of your code base. And quality includes both these two things. One, are there any issues, quality issues in your code? And second, what is the status of the core metrics that somehow tell you about the health of your code base? So as part of metrics, you can track test coverage, you can track documentation coverage, and then you can define your own metrics that you want to track about. So, for example, if you're writing a front-end library, of JavaScript library, one quality metric could be the size, the bundle size that you ship to production, right? So majorly two parts. One, continuous quality means you being able to track the most important metrics that define in your context, what is the quality of your code base. And second, issues, are these quality issues present in your code base or not? And which could mean security issues, which could mean performance issues, documentation issues, things like that. I hope that answers, right? So I'm going to take an example of Python. So when you start, if you're writing a Python project, and when you start figuring out, okay, now I need to write documentation for my Python. So this is the first step that you have to do when you're figuring out what's the convention that we need to follow. First, are you writing module level doc strings or not? All right, and that completely depends on your preference. Second, classes. Are you writing doc strings for classes or for your dunder-init methods? Are you writing doc strings for your magic methods or not? Or are you writing doc strings for your, say, private methods or underscored methods or not? And lastly, are you documenting your tests? And this list can go on. There are maybe a few other decisions that I might have skipped, but this generally gives you a gist of the first step that you have to take in terms of defining, this is the convention that the entire team, or say, for example, this project is going to follow. So if you're aware of a lot of open source projects, like pretty good ones, say, for example, Django, the Django project, they have their own guidelines in terms of how they document their code. And that is very important because it keeps everyone on the same page. And the second most important thing is, you can, if you are uniformly documenting and everyone is documenting in the same way, you can write tools to automatically extract those things and maybe build up a documentation side. That's what Sphinx does, the Sphinx documentation generator. So you have to define a convention so it becomes easy for everyone to follow, right? And so I'll stop here for some questions, and then I can show you a demo of how CQ and documentation coverage works on DeepSource. Yep. Right. So the question is, what does it mean when I said the coverage? Does it mean how many objects are documented or the quality? Right. So right now what I'm talking about is just to start with how much documentation exists, right? Because quality, how good the documentation is, that is kind of a subjective metric, and it could be difficult to kind of track automatically. So you can build up tools, you can write some tools to kind of do that and show you that, hey, okay, my public methods should be at least, you can define a convention, say that, okay, my public method should have at least 2 lines of doc strings, something like that, whatever rocks your boat. But then after you have done that, that is something that you can build out on top of it. But here what I'm mostly talking about is the presence of documentation. Because the quality, it can be taken care of manually, because in the end, some human reviewer is going to look at the code and then going to merge it. I hope that answers your question. Right, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Right. Right. So the question is, how do you define metrics for internal projects versus external projects? So, okay, so I'll give you an example here. So let's say the first case is an open source API library, API client, right? Or some library that is used by other people in their code. That can be internal as well. So you are writing a library, private library, which is used by some other team in your company to do something. So there, one of the metrics that you can look at is, so everyone uses IDEs, everyone uses sophisticated IDEs, and which has auto completion, which has it can automatically show you, okay, what does this method do? So there, it's very important to at least document all the public methods that you're exporting. Right? You might not, you can choose not to write documentation. It might not be critical to document things that people don't directly use, but in any public library or any kind of software which exposes a public interface that people are going to use, the critical metric could be anything, document everything that people would use. So that is one. The second case is, let's say you have an application instead. It's not a library. You have an application on which, say, 10 people from your team are working on, right? And in that case, maybe in that case, you don't have that liberty. You don't know that, only the public exported things are getting used. In that case, even documenting tests could be important, because tomorrow a new guy is going to join, and they are going to go ahead and change the tests. So maybe that's where since more people would be looking at that piece of code, you might need to have proper documentation for that. If you're working in a team, maybe you need to you don't just need to document the code per se, but you also need to document some special cases, or you might need to document some design decisions as part of the code. Because tomorrow, if you're making an exception, tomorrow someone might come and they might want to change this because this particular thing doesn't make sense here. So you might want to document and say that, hey, this is why we did it right now. Don't change it because things can break, right? So I think that is one way to kind of think about what metric is important in different scenarios. And in terms of APIs, I guess, you just need to document the endpoints, what they do. So I think we are mostly talking about the code, not the exposed API endpoints. I'm sorry. Yeah. Any other questions so far? Okay, so I'll just move on to show you guys a short demo. So yeah, so I'll just give a brief introduction of what DeepSource is and how it kind of fits into how you can use it for tracking some documentation coverage here. So DeepSource is a continuous quality tool. It helps you, keep track of quality issues in your code, and also helps you keep track of the core metrics, as I was saying, core metrics that signal the quality of your code base. So it's fairly easy to integrate. It's completely free for open source. It's fairly easy to integrate with GitHub. You install the GitHub app onto your account, and then you just drop a configuration file, and then you can enable the analysis. And on every change that you make, the analysis will run, and it will show you issues. It'll it'll report the metrics, and then you get a quality dashboard for your project where you can track the core metrics, and you can see the current state in terms of how many issues are there and what is the current metrics, what is the value of the current metrics, right? So I'm going to talk about two things here. One, yeah. I'll just do that, the demo, yeah. Yeah, so just give me 1 second, I'll just hop onto that. So, yeah, so as you can see, every team, depending on their context, you can define what are the quality metrics that make sense to you, right? And so one way that we are going to talk about is the documentation coverage of code. So the documentation coverage, as I explained before, what we are going to track is how much documentation is needed and how much documentation is present, right? And that's the simplest measure. It's not about the quality of the documentation, but to start with, that's the simplest measure of something. Instead of just not tracking anything, let's just track something. So when you use DeepSource, just one configuration file, it automatically starts reporting the documentation coverage. Now to look at how, so this is one of our private repositories, by the way. So the first step that I was talking about is first to define a convention for your code, a convention for your team on how you write documentation. So if you can see, you need to define, so we give you options to define where you want to skip the documentation. So by default, what we do is we count all definitions. For example, we count all modules, classes, and methods as objects that need documentation, right? So that is the default setting. And then you can say that, hey, I don't want to write documentation for my module level. I don't want to write documentation for the magic methods. And I don't want to write documentation on the class level, which means everything else will be counted. So this configuration, so this is the first step. This configuration will actually count all public classes, the init methods of all public classes, and any other methods that exist, right? So that is the first part. You define a convention that, hey, this is how I'm going to write. Once you have done that, then every, whenever you make changes to your code, the metrics are reported. What is in this particular PR? So for every pull request, we analyze the code, right? So every pull request, you see, okay, what is the documentation coverage? So right now, the documentation coverage is 70%. If I had added more documentation, this would have gone up. And in the core metrics, this is the current state of the code. So the current state says the current documentation coverage for my Python code is 70%. And you can see that line has like flat line. We haven't written a lot of documentation in the past, but that's what it is. So the current state of your code for all our Python code, we have 70% documentation coverage, which means 70% of all the objects that we expect, that we want to write documentation for, we have written documentation for 70%. Right? So this is the current state of your code, and then every change that you make, you can track, okay, where does the documentation coverage go after this change? Right? And when this particular pull request gets merged, your metric, of course, it increases. And that's how you can track on a continuous basis how your documentation coverage is increasing. The second thing is, and coming back to the question that you asked, source code issues, right? So let me see if there are issues. Yep. Right. So two kinds of source code issues, not two kinds actually, just one, missing doc strings in a public function. So this is something that I was talking about. If you're writing a public library, or if you want to write documentation for all your public objects, whatever, right? Then this is how we report that, hey, okay, this particular thing doesn't have tests, doesn't have a documentation, right? So whenever you make some change and then it runs, whenever you make some change and the analysis runs, this issue will actually show up as part of the analysis. So this doesn't have any issue. Let me go to a pull request which has some issues. Yeah, it doesn't have the documentation issue, but this is how it'll look like. So if you have added a new function which doesn't have doc strings, it'll show up here saying, hey, you just added this function, it doesn't have doc strings. So as part of your code review workflow, you can actually enforce that anyone who writes a new function, they must write documentation for that function as well. And if you see in our repo, we have made the severity to minor. So you can actually, and don't hate us for that. You can convert it to critical, and once it is critical, this will actually cause your analysis runs to fail, right? So if we find an issue like this in the analysis run, it'll just fail and it won't allow you to merge the code. So this is a very simple way that you can enforce in your team. Let's say going crazy in a week, and you say that no, we just want to write documentation in this week. You switch it to critical, and everything will start breaking unless people write documentation. Right? Let me just switch it back to minor. Right. So that covers the second part. I think you have some questions. Okay. Right. So that covers the second part of the three steps that I was talking about. How do you continuously track and improve upon the documentation? So two things. One, tracking these metrics and these issues that are raised as part of your code review workflow that can help you write new documentation. And then, of course, you can take a look at all these existing issues. Yep. And all the existing issues in your code base, and you can say that, hey, okay, where are these functions that don't have documentation that we need to write documentation? That covers the third part when you are writing documentation for your existing code base, which lacks any documentation. Right. So yeah, that concludes the demo. Any questions? Yep. So again, so that depends on what you want to do as a team. But if you want to enforce, then you can, if you're using a CQ tool like DeepSource, and there are other tools as well. So if you're using a tool like that, you don't actually need to enforce that as part of your code reviews. You can just configure this, and it'll just fail. And even if you're, unless you're an administrator and you're using your admin privileges, you can't merge the code. So right. 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 Of course. So I think that again, I think that's up to the preference of the team itself. But you should be able to configure that. That's one. You should be able to configure the setting. That okay, what is the level of documentation do we expect as a team? And second, you should be able to configure that as a gate as well. That do I really need every public object to be documented as a critical thing in code review workflow? So of course, if you set it up like that, there is room for exceptions. As you said, if some developer is I mean, I don't have any views on that specifically, but I think you can do that, as it depends on your team. Yes. Right. So the question is, does the tool help you figure out how good the documentation is? So no, it doesn't do that. Sorry about that. But yeah, we help you track the quantity of documentation. Eventually, we are working on more and more capabilities in the platform that can help you, detect the quality of the documentation as well. But more so, we don't want to be the arbiters of what's good and what's wrong. What we want to do is we want to give this give this decision in your hands, and you can take this decision, right? Because how good the documentation is of course very subjective, and we don't want to do that. But what we can do is help you figure out whether are you doing the right thing or not. So one of the things that we are working on is when you're changing a function, right? If you have changed the function signature, we can detect that, okay, if you have changed the function signature, have you also changed the docstring of the function, right? And that is something that is not subjective, that is objective, because if you're changing the signature, you have to change the docstring. And if you're not doing that, maybe you're doing something wrong. But to determine whether you have written 10 lines of docstrings, that is something that as a tool we don't want to be doing. But that's something that it's better to leave up to the human reviewers for looking at code. I think he was yeah. Right. Right. So the question is, instead of trying to enforce, can we reward writing a documentation? That's a very good point, actually. We might actually think about how we can make it better in terms of how the model works itself, as in how you look at these issues and metrics. But I think it's a little bit, talking completely from a product perspective, I think it's a little bit out of scope for our product to kind of gamify this, in terms of making a leaderboard and things like that. But I think that's an excellent way of improving the documentation. Maybe that can be done offline. Maybe that can be done outside of the tool. And to answer part of the other thing that you said, that existing tools already help you do that, right? And people can skip it, right? So running these tools as part of your pre-commit workflow. The biggest problem with that is not everyone is going to do that, right? If you have a 50-people team, you really can't enforce everyone having them. Maybe you can, but a lot of companies, a lot of teams that we have seen, heck, even our team, we have 4 developers. We have a small team, 4 developers. Everyone uses a different IDE, right? And that's a big problem, right? And second, it's not just about the issues, but also the coverage. Some metric that you have to keep a track on. Just draw a parallel between this and test coverage. If you're not tracking test coverage, you're probably not even caring about tests. So I think that's where something like a visualization of this makes sense, instead of just running these tools standalone. I hope that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. Right. Get that a lot. So not at the moment. So we just launched the company. We started the company 6 months back. The product was launched 3 months back. So right now we just focused on Python. Next month we are releasing support for Go. But eventually, we'll be adding more language support, and we'll actually be opening up our analyzer spec, so anyone can create an analyzer, and they can build tools to kind of track anything that you want to. But speaking right now, we only support Python at the moment. So you were asking a question. So yeah, as in you can. That's one way to put it. But so we don't want to use the term. I don't want to use the term enforce, to be honest, because it's up to you, right? It's up to because it's it's up to your preference. So if documentation is something that's important to you, So for example, so we have one more analyzer called test coverage, and it actually flags if we are adding some code without adding tests for it, right? And we can track that as an issue. So that is something that is critical for us, and that might not be critical for you, right? So we don't want to be, as I said, we don't want to be the arbiters, but we want to facilitate if you want to do that. So as Jay was mentioning, in our previous company, we didn't have any tests at all. And when I say any test, like we didn't even have like CI suite set up. And we were shipping code to production and we had paying customers. And that was like horrible because things were breaking all the time. And then one day we decided that that's not a good place to be in. So we decided that from today onwards, even if we don't have test coverage for the existing code, we will write tests for any other code, any new code that we write. Now, if you want to do that for your team, you should be able to, somehow create a rule that helps you enforce it. And that's basically, from a product perspective, that's what we are trying to do. That, helping you discover these issues in the first place and then giving you options so that you can enforce it if you want to. If you don't, I hope so. Right. Right. Yeah. Can you just... Yeah. So a lot of companies one of the major chunk of what the tool does. So documentation is one part, test coverage is the second part, but the major chunk of what the tool does itself is help you discover problems in your code. And these problems are, let me just go back here once. If you look at this, these are the kinds of issues that we help you detect. Bug risks, anti-patterns in your code, security vulnerabilities, style issues, performance, and then of course documentation. So documentation is one part of what we do. So most of the companies who are using DeepSource today, they kind of use mostly for the security and anti-patterns and correctness part of that. But also they track test coverage and documentation. Now, a lot of these companies internally, they have their own conventions and they have their own way of how they want to track this. But there is one company, I can't see the name, but there is one company, 200 people strong, 70 people in the engineering team. They are currently they're trying out the product in a pilot, and they were the most impressed by the documentation. As in, when we showed them the dashboard. So that company has been around for like 5-6 years, I guess, and their documentation is really broken. So this year they have started writing more and more documentation. When we showed them that, hey, this is how you can track it, that was the most attractive thing for them. So to kind of answer your question, it kind of depends on the company itself, depends on the stage where they are. So I've seen a lot of startups, small teams really care about documentation from day one, documentation and tests from day one. Like we did that. Like in our previous company, we didn't care about documentation and tests at all. Like it's true story. We started writing tests in the 3rd year of the company, right? As in 3 years later, right? But when we started DeepSource, we put importance of documentation and tests from day one. So I think it kind of depends. But yeah, we have had like a couple of examples. Yeah.
So to give you a metric around that, so the company you were talking about was 6 years old, 200 engineers. So their documentation coverage before starting to measure was 7%, but in last 2 months, they had gone up to some 42 or 43%. So that was checked last week. So the process it's not complete. So at the moment, it's not qualitative, because qualitative is again very subjective, but in terms of quantity, it's the way of the simple thing like a Boy Scout rule, like whenever you touch something, you fix it, right? So that, at least for these guys, it's kind of working, and I think that will probably work for others as well. Yeah.
Yes, they are probably the largest competitors that we have, but they have horrible UX. You won't probably like it. You should probably use DeepSource instead. I'm not even kidding. Yeah, so yeah, the same space, yeah. Any other questions or anything on topic, off topic? Yep. Yep. No, not right now. But that, so again, so that is part of what I explained that we are actually working on. So, when, say, for example, a function, if you're changing, say, the signature of the function, then you have to change the documentation, the doc strings. If you're not doing that, then probably you're not doing something right. But anything other than that, it's kind of gets very difficult to, so you can say that, hey, whenever someone changes a function, you should change the documentation, but that doesn't really make sense because you might not change the behavior of the code at all. It's kind of a shaky ground there to go, more on the qualitative side.
So in terms of document generation, like there were students from college, they tried to generate documentation for your code. Like for example, taking a look at what your function is doing, because programming languages are finite, right? You can do only certain things, right? By just reading what your function is doing, they automatically generate language, as in English on the documentation. But again, that did not go far because before building documentation coverage, we are actually thinking, is there a way we can measure quality, right? But there's a fine line which you need to draw here. For example, if you take an example of Go, they have these simple conventions like whenever you're documenting a function, it should start with the name of the function, right? So that is where you stop. If you want, you can still go beyond that. For example, for every function, you have to have 2 lines of documentation, but that doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't know, it's simple language, right? So that is where tracking is one way to go, is because how you document it is completely up to you. So yeah, that paper is actually pretty interesting. I'll probably share in a comment or something where they were trying to generate documentation based on machines reading your code. So yeah, that should be an interesting way for you guys who are interested in how to measure quality of the sentence written documentation.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So for a lot of so for example, Python has a PEP called PyDocStyle. So Python Software Foundation, they have put down a set of conventions on how you are supposed to write docstrings, and they have built tools that detect some of these things. There is some bit of automation, but I won't say those are like qualitative things. Those are mostly rules, but that kind of goes a little into the territory of measuring how good your code, how good the docstring, but not completely into it.
Spell checks and grammar.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually a good. Yeah. Yes. Right. Right. That actually makes sense. I think mostly it's a linking problem. That could be, So one of the users, they suggested that, so since we're already detecting the problems, they're like qualitative problems, but which could cause some issues. And then there are like a lot of error tracking tools like sentries. So what if you can link if some error occurs, and then you can probably point that, hey, okay, this error has occurred, and this could be the reason which exists in your. This could be the reason because this issue exists in your code base right now. And maybe there you can maybe point to that, hey, this is the documentation. Doesn't have documentation, maybe you should write one. I think that could be done. Right? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you. Yeah. Do you guys mind if I take a quick selfie with you guys? Yeah. For our Twitter page, which I'd like you guys to go in.